Humanity clawed its way through ice ages, famine, and actual plagues only to produce people who light cigarettes next to ruptured gas lines and try to catch statues with their bare hands. Welcome back to the absolute basement of human intellect. Today, we have 10 jaw-dropping fatalities proving that common sense is a mythological superpower. Please don't use this as a tutorial. 1. There is a very fine line between proactive pest control and accidental domestic demolition. Our first genius, a man living in a densely packed Brazilian apartment complex, sprinted right past that line and kept on running. He found himself locked in a bitter turf war with a massive colony of cockroaches. Now, a normal human being deals with this by calling an exterminator. Maybe you buy some heavy-duty traps. Not this guy. He viewed these bugs as an occupying army. Store-bought bug spray wasn't getting the job done, so his frustration mutated into lethal culinary innovation. Standing in his tiny kitchen, eyeing his standard-issue gas stove, he hatched a plan. It was a plan that made perfect sense if you had zero understanding of basic chemistry. He decided to turn his kitchen into a high-yield makeshift bomb. With the frantic energy of a madman, he went to work sealing the perimeter. Wet towels got shoved under the doorframe. Duct tape went over the window edges. In under 10 minutes, he had essentially built a hermetically sealed box of doom inside his own home. Once he was satisfied that not a single draft could get in, he reached for the stove dials. He cranked all the burners to the maximum setting, but he didn't ignite them. He just let the raw, uncombusted natural gas hiss into the room. The invisible cloud poured over the counters and sank into the floorboards. Stepping out into the hallway and shutting the kitchen door tight, he likely stood there with a smug grin, picturing those six-legged invaders choking on his brilliant airborne assault. Planning to let this toxic trap marinate for a few hours before casually opening a window, he truly believed he had outsmarted millions of years of insect evolution. However, his flawless battle plan had one catastrophic plot hole. He sealed the kitchen, sure, but gas expands. Gas drifts. And right next door, in an adjoining utility closet, sat his water heater. A water heater equipped with an automatic, constantly burning pilot light. Let's do some quick, incredibly unfortunate math. You take a heavily concentrated volume of highly flammable methane. You confine it to an airtight space. Then, you introduce it to a relentless open flame. The result is not a pest-free environment. The result is a sudden, violent reorganization of the local architecture. The creeping gas inevitably found that tiny blue flame. It instantly achieved the perfect mixture for a devastating thermobaric event. The ensuing explosion was spectacular. It didn't just eradicate the roaches. It instantly promoted our protagonist to a permanent gaseous state. The blast blew the exterior walls of his kitchen straight out into the street. It completely rearranged his living room furniture into splinters. It even generously distributed the structural damage to 3 neighboring apartments. The local authorities didn't need a forensic team to figure out the cause of death. The overwhelming evidence of a tactical blunder and a very sudden departure told the whole story. In his desperate bid to win the war against the bugs, he turned his apartment into a fragmentation grenade. He proved once and for all that cockroaches might survive a nuclear fallout, but they absolutely cannot survive a stubbornly idiotic tenant with a gas leak. 2. Evolution spent millions of years developing the human brain so we could invent fishing poles. But clearly, that memo missed our next genius. He was a dedicated practitioner of noodling. For the uninitiated, this is the deeply idiotic southern tradition of wading into murky, snake-infested rivers and shoving your bare hands into dark underwater holes. The goal is to let a massive catfish aggressively bite your fingers so you can wrestle it to the surface. It is a hobby that treats basic survival instincts as a mild suggestion. Our guy considered himself the absolute apex predator of the local creek. Wading chest-deep in zero-visibility water, his foot bumped into something massive. He felt around blindly in the mud. He discovered a huge, sprawling underwater cavern burrowed deep into the riverbank. Now, a seasoned river veteran knows catfish prefer tight mud holes. A massive, structured tunnel woven with sticks belongs to a completely different aquatic resident. But our guy was blinded by the dream of catching a river monster. He assumed the sheer size of the hole meant a trophy fish was hiding in the back. He crouched down into the muddy water and reached his arm inside. The tunnel kept going. He didn't want the imaginary fish to escape. So, he made a decision that fundamentally violated common sense. He took a deep breath, submerged himself completely, and crammed his head and both broad shoulders deep into the pitch-black tunnel. He successfully infiltrated the living room of a very large, deeply unamused North American beaver. Beavers are essentially aquatic wood chippers with anger management issues. When this startled resident found a wildly thrashing human face in its living room, it did not hesitate. The beaver delivered a blindingly fast, agonizingly sharp warning bite straight through the meaty part of his hand. Then, it gracefully swam out a back exit. The agonizing jolt of pain triggered an immediate, explosive panic response. He violently jerked his body backward to escape the muddy tomb. This is where basic physics and architecture enacted fatal revenge. Beaver lodges are meticulously woven with inward-facing sticks and logs. Beaver lodges are nature's equivalent of a giant one-way puzzle box. He slithered in smoothly by angling his body. But in his blind, thrashing panic to reverse course, his shoulders squared up. They wedged brutally against the uneven, jagged, unyielding logs framing the entrance. The harder he violently kicked his legs in the open water behind him, the deeper and tighter his collarbones locked into the wood. He had willingly squeezed his upper body into a submerged vice grip. Unable to simply back out, his oxygen-starved brain short-circuited entirely. His frantic, useless underwater struggles rapidly consumed whatever meager breath he had left. The murky river quietly reclaimed him. Local rescue divers eventually had to spend 3 confused hours dismantling a beaver dam, just to retrieve a man who had successfully managed to catfish himself right out of the gene pool. 3. Somewhere in rural France, tucked between a wheat field and a gas station, sat a sticky-floored dive bar that had witnessed more bad decisions than a Las Vegas wedding chapel. On this particular evening, it was about to host the single dumbest wager in the entire history of competitive masculinity. Nobody remembers how the argument actually started. It might have been a debate over a soccer penalty, it might have been a perceived slight against someone's mother. It was likely just the primal urge of 2 proud men needing to prove who possessed more unregulated testosterone. Raised voices over sticky tables quickly escalated into a shoving match. Rather than settling things with a standard parking lot fist fight, the duo demanded a more dramatic arena. Driven by a spectacular blend of immense pride and microscopic brain function, they stumbled out into the night, marching directly toward the nearby high-speed rail network to engage in the ultimate duel of sheer willpower. Neither man was looking to dodge a sluggish freight train. Instead, the pair specifically chose the domain of the TGV. This is France's engineering marvel. It is thousands of tons of aerodynamic steel hurtling down the rails at nearly 200 miles per hour. The rules of their incredibly dim-witted contest were simple, yet entirely fatal. Both combatants would stand directly on the tracks, facing away from each other so they couldn't see the other man flinch. The first one to step off the rails as the metallic thunderbolt approached would be branded a coward. Positioning themselves squarely on the wooden ties, the rivals stood rigidly back-to-back like 18th-century gentlemen preparing for a pistol duel. Crossing their arms and staring off into the dark countryside, these two completely ignored the rapidly intensifying vibrations, humming through the soles of their boots. The terrifying, high-pitched shriek of the approaching train cut through the night. It was a mechanical banshee, screaming a warning. Any creature with a functioning brainstem would have jumped. Our 2 gladiators of stupidity remained hopelessly anchored by their own vanity. Inside the conductor's cabin, the horrified driver slammed his fists onto the emergency brakes. Sparks flew across the tracks. But the unforgiving laws of physics dictate that a bullet train cannot stop on a dime. It certainly can't stop just to accommodate 2 morons having a macho crisis. The blinding glare of the headlamp washed over them. The deafening roar of the engine threatened to shatter their eardrums. Incredibly, neither man broke rank. Each one was cosmically certain the other idiot would flinch first. Both men were so catastrophically wrong that the universe didn't even have time to correct them. The resulting impact was less of a collision and more of a full-body express checkout from the physical realm. The two proud combatants were instantly and permanently relieved of all future scheduling conflicts. When the bewildered local authorities finally arrived to document the chaotic aftermath, they had to write a report. The lead investigator penned what remains arguably the funniest official document in municipal history. The police report did not call it a tragic misunderstanding. It cleanly summarized the high-stakes test of bravery. It officially concluded that the contest was a completely flawless tie. There were 0 winners, only 2 participants who reached their final destination much sooner than expected. And there was a bullet train that required a very extensive trip through the nearest heavy-duty wash cycle. 4. Meet Dieter, a man whose patience was thinner than the drywall of his apartment and whose capacity for petty revenge was absolutely bottomless. Pushed to the brink of madness by his upstairs neighbor's relentless party noise, a normal tenant might leave a passive-aggressive note or call the police. Dieter decided to bypass standard mediation and engineer a weapon of mass acoustic warfare. He wanted to scientifically humiliate his enemies by forcing them to aggressively soil themselves in front of their party guests. He spent months researching and custom building a massive weaponized subwoofer. He affectionately dubbed this monstrous creation the brown note. For those unfamiliar with urban legends, the brown note is a hypothetical low-frequency sound wave. It supposedly resonates perfectly with the human digestive tract. The myth claims it causes anyone within earshot to instantly lose total control of their bowels. It is completely fake pseudoscience. Our hero treated it as hard, weaponizable fact. Hauling this refrigerator-sized speaker into his living room and aiming it directly at the ceiling, he was practically vibrating with malicious glee. After securely locking his apartment door to ensure no one interrupted his masterpiece of petty revenge, he strapped on a pair of heavy-duty industrial earmuffs to protect his own hearing, grabbed the receiver dial, and cranked the amplifier to maximum capacity. The moment he flipped the switch, he unleashed a barrage of intense sub-bass frequencies. It was not a sound you could hear. It was a physical force you could feel in your teeth. But he blew right past a fundamental rule of structural physics. Sound waves are literal kinetic energy. Pumping that much concentrated force into a confined space violently shakes the entire structural integrity of the room. As the walls vibrated and the floorboards rattled, his upstairs neighbors remained entirely continent. They were just confused by the sudden localized earthquake. Meanwhile, right behind our triumphant acoustic warrior, the invisible shockwaves were aggressively rattling a massive wooden bookshelf. This was not some wobbly discount shelf held together by hope and an Allen wrench. It was a solid oak, floor-to-ceiling unit loaded with decades of heavy, leather-bound encyclopedias. The intense, relentless vibrations systematically walked the heavy furniture forward inch by inch. Right at the peak of his perceived victory, the entire unit reached its tipping point. The massive shelf pitched forward, dumping hundreds of pounds of dense literature directly onto the back of his skull. Because of his heavy-duty industrial earmuffs, he never even heard it coming. The sheer weight of the collapsing wood and thousands of pages of human knowledge instantly flattened him against the floorboards. His master plan to ruin his neighbor's evening resulted in his own immediate, highly educational demise. When the police eventually broke down the locked door, they found him fatally buried under Volume 4 of a vintage encyclopedia set. The legendary brown note turned out to be a complete myth, but gravity, tragically for Dieter, was an absolute reality. 5. Suburban gardening is generally considered a peaceful, meditative hobby. But for a certain breed of hyper-competitive homeowner, a backyard vegetable patch is an intense botanical battleground. Our next gardening enthusiast was absolutely obsessed with achieving perfect, nutrient-rich soil. He maintained a massive compost heap in his yard. However, he possessed zero patience for the agonizingly slow, biological process of organic decomposition. He wanted prime fertilizer, and he wanted it immediately. Instead of just turning the pile with a pitchfork like a normal person, he decided to accelerate nature using heavy industrial chemistry. After acquiring a 50-pound commercial barrel of highly concentrated calcium oxide, known in the construction industry as quicklime, He treated the bright yellow hazard warnings like decorative wallpaper. Here's the part where his plan runs headfirst into actual science. Quicklime is a highly reactive caustic alkaline substance used for treating raw sewage, and when introduced to water, it triggers a wildly violent exothermic reaction. Unburdened by this scientific knowledge, our backyard botanist viewed the chemical as a magical disintegrator powder. Dragging the heavy barrel over to his prized mound of rotting vegetable peels, he tipped the container and dumped the entire payload into the damp compost. Admiring his handiwork, he was completely unaware he had just constructed a crude chemical volcano. Deciding the mixture needed a little help to activate, he grabbed his garden hose, leaned his face directly above the white crater to get a closer look, and twisted the nozzle to a high-pressure stream. The exact second the cold water made contact with the massive pile of calcium oxide, the reaction was catastrophic. The water did not soak into the dirt. It instantly flash-boiled. The pile erupted with the sudden fury of a geyser. A high-pressure column of superheated, caustic chemical steam shot straight upward like a rocket. Taking a direct, point-blank hit to the face, our impatient gardener instinctively gasped in pure shock. Unfortunately, drawing a massive breath inside a rapidly expanding, 300-degree alkaline cloud is fundamentally incompatible with human biology. The overwhelming chemical vapor instantly shut down his respiratory system, abruptly canceling his subscription to breathing in a fraction of a second. Dropping the hose, he collapsed backward onto his meticulously manicured lawn, quickly concluding his career as a gardener in the most ironic way possible. His quest to aggressively speed up the natural decaying process was technically a massive success. The mission was accomplished beyond his wildest dreams. He did not just create a fantastic batch of accelerated compost, he rapidly accelerated his own personal timeline to become a permanent part of the local ecosystem. The paramedics arrived to find a perfectly watered lawn and a homeowner who had miraculously managed to chemically outsmart himself with his own yard clippings. 6. Quick poll. When you rent a piece of heavy machinery capable of ripping through solid earth, do you A. call the utility company to mark underground lines, or B. just start digging and hope for the best? If you picked B, congratulations, you share a brain cell with our final contestant. Our final mastermind was a fiercely independent homeowner who decided that paying professional contractors to dig a backyard swimming pool was a massive financial scam. Firmly believing his weekend warrior skills were more than sufficient for major excavation, he marched down to the local equipment rental yard and happily drove away with a bright yellow, diesel-powered mini-excavator. Every single piece of literature, every rental agreement, and dozens of heavily enforced municipal laws clearly state that you must call utility companies before tearing into the earth. Our guy viewed these strict legal warnings as cowardly suggestions for people who lacked his supreme masculine intuition. He parked the heavy machinery in his backyard, fired up the hydraulic pump, and began violently clawing massive scoops of dirt out of his pristine lawn. He was having the time of his life, tearing a deep trench into the earth. He was completely oblivious to the massive, invisible infrastructure buried just beneath his property line. On roughly his 15th scoop, the heavy steel teeth of the excavator bucket did not hit a stubborn rock. They violently hooked onto a high-pressure, commercial-grade municipal natural gas main. With the agonizing screech of tearing metal, the heavy hydraulic arm effortlessly ripped a massive hole straight through the thick steel pipe. The result was instantaneous and terrifying. An ear-splitting, deafening hiss erupted from the bottom of the trench. A massive, invisible plume of highly pressurized, extremely flammable methane began violently blasting out of the pit and enveloping the yard. The overwhelming, sickening stench of sulfur immediately flooded the entire backyard. Every neuron in a halfway developed mammalian brain would scream to run from this scenario. It was an active, ticking bomb. The standard survival protocol is to drop everything, sprint as far away as humanly possible, and scream for emergency services. Our brilliant operator did exactly none of those things. Calmly turning off the excavator's engine to stop the annoying noise, he climbed out of the cab and walked over to the edge of the crater. Sitting down on a pile of freshly dug dirt, he attempted to visually assess the catastrophic damage he had just inflicted upon the city grid. Surrounded by a concentrated cloud of invisible explosive gas, his brain recognized that he was in a stressful situation. To calm his frazzled nerves and figure out a do-it-yourself fix, he relied on an old, deeply ingrained habit. He reached into his chest pocket, pulled out a slightly crumpled cigarette, and placed it between his lips with the calm deliberation of a man on a smoke break, not a man sitting directly above a ruptured high-pressure gas main. Then he casually flicked his metal lighter. He never even got to taste the tobacco. The tiny, innocent spark from the flint instantly ignited the massive, invisible cloud of pure methane billowing up from the deep trench. The resulting volumetric explosion was absolutely apocalyptic. It was a massive, concussive fireball that instantly ended the shift of our overly relaxed operator. The blast launched the 5-ton rental machine completely over the property fence. It permanently resolved his swimming pool project by leaving behind a perfectly smooth, heavily scorched, glass-lined crater. As it turns out, doing it yourself is sometimes just a spectacularly efficient method of instantly relocating your atoms to a neighboring zip code. 7. A bronze military statue. 2,000 pounds of oxidized metal bolted to a concrete pedestal in a quiet Polish municipal park. To an educated art historian, it was a priceless cultural artifact. To the two nocturnal entrepreneurs casing it from across the street, it was simply a giant payday waiting to be melted down at the local scrapyard. Armed with battery-powered angle grinders and a breathtaking amount of unearned confidence, they crept into the park well past midnight. The plan was to cleanly sever the statue precisely at its bronze ankles. They would topple the metallic giant onto the grass, load it into a stolen van, and vanish before sunrise. However, as they began throwing sparks into the night sky, a terrifying logistical hurdle occurred to them. A solid piece of cast bronze weighing upwards of 1,500 pounds does not fall gracefully. When it finally detached, it was going to hit the pavement with a deafening, thunderous crash. That noise would instantly wake up every resident in a 3-block radius and undoubtedly summon the local police force. They desperately needed a silencer. They needed a way to manually control the descent of a monument. This is the exact moment where human stupidity transcends into high art. The lead thief clearly believed he possessed the superhuman skeletal density of a comic book hero. He devised a solution so monumentally flawed it actively insults the laws of nature. He instructed his partner to keep grinding away at the rear of the ankles. Meanwhile, he confidently stepped around to the very front of the towering, top-heavy statue. He squared his stance, bent his knees slightly, and raised his arms like an Olympic weightlifter, preparing for a clean and jerk. He fully intended to physically catch the plummeting mass of solid bronze against his own chest. He planned to gently and quietly lower it to the pavement like a sleeping toddler. He completely catastrophically underestimated the unforgiving, merciless reality of concentrated mass. His partner's grinding wheel finally severed the last critical millimeter of bronze support. Gravity immediately took the wheel. The colossal metal general pitched forward into the darkness. The confident catcher stood his ground, fully ready to absorb the impact. The moment the rigid, unyielding bronze made contact with his outstretched hands, his skeletal structure was instantly outvoted by physics. There was no gentle lowering. There was no heroic struggle. The heavy historical figure simply ignored his existence. It folded the man backward with the unstoppable force of a falling meteor. The heavy bronze made a very permanent executive decision regarding his physical form, pinning him flat against the cold cobblestone in a fraction of a second. It was an incredibly sudden and permanent retirement from the criminal arts. However, from a purely objective standpoint, his wildly idiotic acoustic dampening plan worked flawlessly. By placing himself directly in the drop zone, he successfully prevented the heavy metal from ever striking the pavement. There was no loud crash to echo through the sleeping neighborhood and wake the police. The statue simply landed with a dull, highly fatal thud. His ridiculous attempt to keep the heist quiet resulted in his immediate demise, while generously providing a spectacularly silent, uninterrupted getaway for his utterly terrified partner. 8. Kyle was the kind of guy who measured his self-worth in arc welds and metal shavings. He could fabricate damn near anything out of raw steel, and he made sure every single person in his neighborhood knew it. Unfortunately, unparalleled welding skills offer zero protection against basic atmospheric chemistry. Spending weeks in his garage fabricating a custom barbecue smoker, this remarkably talented metalworker used thick steel plating, welded the hinges, and perfectly sealed the joints. The finished product looked less like a cooking appliance and more like a piece of a decommissioned submarine. Naturally, he was itching to give it a test run. He needed to season the raw metal before throwing in a brisket. But when the time came to fire up his metal baby, the weather outside was a bit chilly. He looked at his driveway. He looked back at his comfortable enclosed garage. Then, he made a decision so colossally misguided, it redefines the concept of laziness. Instead of pushing this heavy metal beast outside, where the Earth's atmosphere could dilute the fumes, he kept it inside, right next to his toolboxes. He loaded the belly of the steel beast with a mountain of charcoal briquettes. He grabbed a massive plastic jug of lighter fluid and soaked the coals. The whole room smelled like a commercial refinery. He struck a match and admired the roaring inferno. He gave zero thought to the fundamental laws of combustion. Fire requires oxygen. In return, it produces things you really shouldn't breathe. To ensure the smoke thoroughly coated the inside of his new toy, he shut the heavy lid. Then, in a stroke of absolute anti-genius, he hit the button to close the main garage door. He wanted to trap the heat. He successfully converted his workspace into a sealed execution chamber. He unfolded a cheap nylon lawn chair, cracked open a beer, and sat down. He was just a few feet away from his creation, monitoring the temperature gauge. If you are familiar with burning charcoal in a low-oxygen environment, you know it aggressively produces carbon monoxide. It is a stealthy, odorless, colorless gas. It doesn't make you choke. It doesn't sting your eyes. It just quietly unplugs your central nervous system. As he sat there admiring his handiwork, the invisible poison filled the room. He started to feel a wave of profound drowsiness. He probably thought he was just tired from all that heavy lifting. He was completely unaware that his internal organs were screaming for oxygen. His brain slowly powered down like a laptop with a dying battery. He closed his eyes. He thought he was just taking a quick 5-minute power nap while the coals turned gray. That nap seamlessly transitioned into a permanent dirt sleep. By the time anyone discovered him, the silent killer had completely flooded the room. They found him sitting peacefully in front of a beautifully seasoned, perfectly functional barbecue. He achieved the ultimate slow-cooked irony. He accidentally turned himself into the very first casualty of his own backyard cookout. 9. A detached garage in a quiet German suburb. The door reinforced with steel plates, 3 industrial deadbolts, metal bars across the only window. From the outside, it looked like a government black site. Inside, it was the headquarters of the single worst physicist on the European continent. Entirely convinced he possessed a towering intellect that rivaled history's greatest minds. After watching a few too many pseudoscience videos on the internet, he decided to tackle the holy grail of impossible engineering. He was going to build a working perpetual motion machine. He transformed his detached backyard garage into a highly secretive laboratory. He spent months frantically assembling a wildly dangerous, deeply unstable mess of heavy industrial magnets, exposed copper wiring, and salvaged electric motors. He firmly believed his chaotic pile of junk was going to generate limitless free energy and revolutionize modern society. With this perceived monumental breakthrough came an intense, suffocating wave of paranoia. He became absolutely terrified that government agents or corporate spies were going to break in and steal his trillion-dollar schematic. To protect his priceless intellectual property, he turned his garage into an impenetrable fortress. He didn't just lock the wooden door. The entire frame got reinforced with solid steel plates. 3 separate, heavy-duty industrial deadbolts went on the inside. Thick metal security bars got bolted across the only window. He essentially built a maximum security bank vault around a massive electrical fire hazard. One fateful evening, he locked himself inside his metal fortress to conduct the final glorious test run. Stepping into a puddle of spilled coolant that he hadn't bothered to mop up, he grabbed the heavy, uninsulated copper grounding cables with his bare hands and flipped the main power breaker. Unsurprisingly, wiring a dozen salvaged industrial motors together without a basic understanding of electrical load capacity does not create infinite energy. It creates a catastrophic, immediate short circuit. The machine didn't spin. It acted as a massive capacitor, dumping thousands of volts of raw, unregulated electricity directly back through the cables. Because he was standing in a conductive puddle, our brilliant inventor instantly became the path of least resistance. A blinding blue arc flash illuminated the heavily soundproofed garage as a lethal current surged through his nervous system. His paranoid security measures kept the world out, but they also ensured nobody heard the violent hum of the overload. When neighbors finally noticed the neighborhood power grid browning out and called the authorities, emergency responders found the reinforced door locked tight. After spending an hour cutting through the steel plates with blowtorches, they discovered the amateur scientist permanently fused to his own invention. He successfully managed to protect his world-changing secret from the general public, taking his flawless design for a highly efficient electrical trap straight to the grave. 10. Have you ever watched a science experiment online and thought, I could scale that up to a life-threatening size? No? Congratulations, your survival instincts are fully operational. Our next content creator did not share this basic biological advantage. Our next visionary was a guy constantly searching for the next bizarre spectacle to film for his drastically unimpressed internet followers. He had recently discovered videos of non-Newtonian fluids, specifically a mixture of water and cornstarch commonly known as oobleck. The magical property of this bizarre substance is simple but incredibly deceptive. If you move slowly and gently, it acts exactly like a liquid. You sink right through it. But the exact second you apply sudden kinetic force, the microscopic starch particles instantly lock together. It violently transforms into a dense, unyielding solid that perfectly mimics wet concrete. Fascinated by this, he decided a tiny mixing bowl wasn't going to generate enough clicks. He required a canvas of catastrophic proportions. After acquiring a commercial-sized deep steel dumpster and parking it in a vacant lot, he spent hours mixing hundreds of pounds of industrial cornstarch with a garden hose, ultimately creating a waist-deep vat of milky, gelatinous doom. Stripping down to his swimsuit, he handed his phone to his equally dim-witted friends. Eager to experience the bizarre sensation of being swallowed by a liquid floor, he climbed into the dumpster and waded into the exact dead center of the trap. Adhering to the science he only half understood, he stood perfectly still. The fluid eagerly accepted his gentle presence. He slowly, satisfyingly sank. The mixture crept up past his knees, enveloped his thighs, and finally settled right around his ribcage. He cheered and posed for the camera. He was the undisputed king of the garbage can. However, having successfully completed step 1 of sinking, he realized he had no exit strategy. Feeling a slight chill, he made a fatal miscalculation. He tried to quickly step away. He sharply yanked his right leg upward. The immediate application of sudden force triggered the fluid's defensive response. The innocent, milky liquid instantly flash froze around the lower half of his body. It turned from a soothing bath into a vice grip of solid starch. Panic immediately flooded his system. He began to violently thrash. He wildly twisted his torso and violently yanked his arms. Every single chaotic, panicked jerk sent shockwaves through the compound. The dense mixture locked up tighter and tighter around his chest cavity. His terrified friends rushed to the edge of the dumpster. They grabbed his flailing arms and pulled hard. Their combined weight pressed against the rim, and the entire top-heavy steel container did exactly what an unanchored dumpster on uneven ground does. It violently tipped over. The milky tidal wave of starch pitched forward and slammed our hero face-first into the concrete. Hundreds of pounds of gelatinous slurry poured over the back of his head and shoulders. Pinned on his stomach, he instinctively tried to push himself up. His palms slammed hard against the spreading pool. The fluid instantly flash-hardened around his hands and forearms, locking them flat against the ground. He thrashed his head sideways to gasp for air, and the violent motion solidified the thick layer of slurry coating his face into a rigid, suffocating mask. Every frantic twitch of his neck sent a fresh shockwave through the compound, tightening the seal. Between his panicked bursts, the mixture softened just enough to creep back over his nose and mouth before his next desperate jerk locked it solid again. He was trapped in a nightmarish cycle. Move and it hardens. Stay still and it flows over your airway. His oxygen-starved brain never got the chance to figure out the paradox. He secured a permanent viral legacy as the only man in recorded history to be fatally outsmarted by baking supplies. Alright, I need a verdict in the comments. Which of these 10 absolute pioneers of stupidity made you physically facepalm the hardest? Pick your favorite evolutionary dropout and tell me exactly why their ghost deserves to be mocked. If your faith in humanity somehow survived this, hit subscribe and drop a like to prove your survival instincts actually function. See you next time. Stay alive.